Good. Thank you. And so, I arrived in Scotland, Aberdeen, on a cold October date in 2020. 2010. It was I heard it was one of the worst snows that had fallen around that time in that year. And it was really cold. Coming from Nigeria, a warm weather, 30 degrees or higher, and I'd come into minus, I don't know what. It was the last day for my registration at the university, and so I got to the house with my family, dropped my things, ran off to the university, and got myself registered in school. And after my registration, I got to one of the staff in the school, and I said, "How can I get to Fountain Hall Street in Aberdeen?" And I was given the map of Aberdeen to find my way through. Now, I never liked geography. And if anything, I think I almost failed geography. And I had the map. I had no idea, couldn't find my way around the school. I couldn't find my way to the bus stop. I had no idea where I was going to or what I needed to do, where to go from there. That leads me to expectations. So when somebody arrives in a new environment, there are expectations. Expectation from the new arrival, expectation from the receiving end. Having come from Africa, where somebody, when I ask such question, somebody could just lead me, take me down to the bus station and literally tell me how to go from there, and would even describe it to me. And now that expectation was not being met, and yet I come to a place where the person who was receiving me said, "You just go look for your way, find your way around." And so expectation on both sides. What did I expect, and what did the other person hope that I would do coming in? So I didn't know where to go from there, but then the truth of it is I found my way. That's why I'm here today. I didn't get lost. So you can be sure I eventually was able to find my way around. And so as we discuss this today, I'm looking at it from three perspectives: mediating between African and European cultural mindset, the importance of world view, difference in cultures, and community engagement. How do we mediate these two mindsets from these two angles? I have two systems here. So, world view. When we're talking about a world view, my expectation from that interaction I've just described was based on my world view. And the expectation from the institution or the person I was speaking with or the person I engaged with was based on their own world view also. And so what is this thing called worldview that kind of determines what we do or how we go about what we do? And so this author would say a worldview is a set of beliefs and assumptions that describe reality. What did I believe? I believe that as a person, I needed to be guided. I've been used to a system. I've been used to a particular way of accessing such services or accessing such information or having things done in a particular way. And meanwhile, the receiving setting also has been used to just doing it the way they do. So our worldview determined that interaction. The Oxford Dictionary also tells us that it's an unconscious but generally coherent set of assumptions. The assumption I had and the assumption from the other end, and yet those assumptions actually were opposite. And beliefs. My belief has been formed, my worldview has been formed based on my belief system and based on a lot of things. Anyway, that's just basically the definition. We'll come to the details later. The worldview influences how we behave, how we think, what we do, and how we go about it. How we deal with social issues, how we interact with people. The worldview is basically how we view the world. And I personally have described worldview as just the window from which we view the world, or the window from which you view the world. So, what is our worldview? Either as individuals or collectively as a community, the things we observe and so on. So, in trying to determine our worldview, how do we formulate worldview? Some time back, I'll go into some of these stories back and forth. And so at some point, I stepped into a situation. And what was that situation? This African child had gone through, I think it was a whole term or a whole academic year. And you know the way the workload is sent back to the home. The parents are given the work that the child had done through the term or through the year, and this child was sent to the home, and the father saw the work that had been done, and there was a particular subject there. The father took exception at what was sent home, and this is a very, very modernized version of it. That page there that has the child, it was worse than that, and I couldn't find that particular one on internet any longer. So what happened? The child took it home, and the father said no, and the picture was an African child on a tree with animals as his or her family, and the child had the nose running and looking really messy with flies all over and things like that. And when the father saw it, he refused and said, no, I don't agree with this. And so he sent a message to the school, and the school responded and said, oh no, we're not racist, and all of that. And so there was this communication between the dad and the school. And so I stepped into it and I said, okay, let me go to the school and let's discuss this. So I got to the school, and the head teacher wasn't around. I sat with the deputy head, and I said, this picture doesn't look very good. And she said, oh no, that's the curriculum. We're not being racist. This is we're just teaching based on the Scottish curriculum. And so we discussed back and forth. We argued back and forth, and she just wasn't understanding and wasn't seeing. So at some point I said to her, so should we swap these children here? I said, can you put a Scottish child here and take the African child off there? And for the first time, she understood what I was trying to pass across. So I said, how would that Scottish child feel in a class of lots of other children, and this African child is made to think that he or she is living among animals, and this child is in Scotland, is in Aberdeen at this time, and schooling with other students, and you want that child to believe that that's who he or she is, and that's where he or she is coming from. And then she understood. And that was taken off the curriculum because I can't find it anymore on internet. And after that year, they didn't send it back to the parents. Now, when we look at that picture, and as I said, this is a refined copy of it. Looking at that picture and watching how those children grow in class, and the Scottish child or the European child is presented as beautifully dressed and looking nice and good, and yes, that's fine and good. But this set of children in the same class whose mindset is being formed and they are growing in the same context, what would be the thinking of the European child of the African child? And what would be the thought of the African child of him or herself and in relation to this? That means that African child is perpetually made to believe that he or she is inferior, and these other children are superior, and these other children are made to think that child, so that's where he or she has come from. Or they may not even think that that's where they have come from. They might actually think that even in Scotland, in the house, there's a tree there, there's an animal there, and that child is interacting with the animal in the room in Scotland. And the mindset, the world view is being formed, is being formulated from there. And these children grow together, beginning to have exchanged the inferiority and superiority complex. And as that grows with them, they believe that one child is superior to the other. And so, as I discussed with that deputy head, and she saw the importance, or she for once realized the impact of what that was doing to the African children, because later you'll be told that, the African children are not confident in themselves, they are not bold and all of that. But when their morale, their identity has been marred right from childhood, what does it do to them as they grow older? And yet, stories like this don't get propagated. The previous story, the previous picture is what we get to see all the time, especially when groups are raising funds, when some charities want to raise funds. We don't get to see this. And these are true pictures. We don't get to see that there are skyscrapers there. We don't get to see that child who was portrayed in a Scottish school as having lived on a tree actually came on a flight to Scotland. He wasn't transported on a tree. Came on a flight. And that's not being told. These are huge buildings within the context in which that child has grown. In fact, this particular child I'm talking about had never lived in a typical village, and so didn't even have a concept of what the school was teaching. As we watch and mindsets are being formulated, worldview is being formulated, it is important to have the right story, the right information to pass across. I wonder if this is a familiar picture also, to show that there's actually no society that is all sufficient in itself. That is a Scottish setting. I picked that breaking news: 135,000 children in Britain would be homeless this Christmas. That's the year in which that was printed. But we don't get to see that. And we don't get to see that there are these other children also who are contented, who are happy where they are, and they're just living life as children would. And so as we formulate our worldview, or help our institutions, help our children to formulate their worldview, it's important that we balance the story and let them know that poverty is real everywhere, across the world, just as people are also comfortable and are doing well across the world. So, in trying to understand the African worldview, which we would compare with the Western worldview, the African worldview revolves around religion and spirituality. At the core of the African mindset, and that's why when you speak with an African all the time, the concept of God just comes across. It's always there. And that's because within the African context, or within the African worldview, the core, the life of the African revolves around a deity. It could be a Christian, Christianity would be God, a Muslim, other religion, or most importantly, the African traditional religion. That is where the African religion, spirituality derives its roots. Such that before Christianity, before Islam, the African had always believed in a deity and had always worshipped in various ways. And of course, Christianity came and Islam came. But when you can't even take religion, you can't take spirituality, you can't take religion out of the African mindset or the African understanding. And so, when you talk with Africans many times and you hear somebody, I don't know if there's a doctor here or a teacher or something, and you get to your child's school and say, this child doesn't seem to be doing very well in school. I wonder who has had that response. One of the responses you will hear would be, I reject it. If it's a Christian, say, I reject it in Jesus' name. What is that person saying? He's saying that everything about me revolves around God, and so even the academics. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. I'm just helping us to understand where the African is coming from. Or if you were a medical doctor and you issue a diagnosis to the African and he says, this is not mine. Denial will come in some sense, but it's flowing from the core of the African worldview that revolves around spirituality and around religion. And if you don't understand him or her and you're working with them, you begin to wonder. You think they are living in denial. In some sense, it could be. But in another sense, that is who they are, because that is the core. That is where every other thing revolves from. So whether Muslim, and that's why an African will always pray anytime. He wakes up and tells you good morning and is asking you how was your day, and you talk about your day and a prayer follows, or you say something and another prayer follows. That's because that is where their life has come from or is revolving from. I am because you are. We'll come to that with time. And so, within the African world view, which is very religious, that is expressed in culture. Sometimes we might think that culture, I've got nothing to do with culture. I mean, a particular set of people are very particular about culture and so on. But the truth is that every human being has lived, has grown, is being molded within a culture. Whatever your culture is, whether you accept it or not, whether you deny it or not, culture is part of your worldview. So, it's a way of life. What is culture? The things that we do. the things that we're exposed to, the people that we interact with, our values, our systems, our understanding, and all of these make up who we are, the way we think, the things we learn, and how we put that together and formulate who we are. And each group of people have culture, and everyone has grown within a culture. I personally have described culture as a living tradition that embraces the entire life of its community. And I believe that actually flows from my African worldview also. That my culture, your culture, even if you don't accept it or you don't want to see it that way, actually is living, because it determines what you do day to day. It determines how you view life and what you do about life, and it's all embracing. It consumes you. It consumes everything that you do, and your actions and your reaction are determined by your culture and exposure to culture. So the African culture, like any other culture, is very particular about lots of this. I mean, I've just put this together just as example, but it covers a lot more than that. And so even within Scotland, when it is cold and it's freezing, particularly if you get to the African churches, or maybe even other churches, on a Sunday, you see the African dressed in their attire, or they want to dress in their attire, because that describes who they are. That is what is valuable to them, and they want to reflect that in their day-to-day activity. What about the song, the music, the dances? And the same wherever you have come from, your culture is reflected in your food, in a lot of the things that the people you interact with. I remember going to one of the situations I handled, and this child the school kept complaining about this child, and they kept saying that the child, it was termed misbehavior. And when the emails about misbehavior kept coming, I just couldn't place what the misbehavior was. And so we met with the school. Yeah, of course, there were little teenage issues around the child, but I met with the school, and one or two other social workers were attached to that. And I was trying to understand so I kept asking questions. So what is this misbehavior? And they couldn't really put it together. But then I was trying to help the school understand where this child was coming from. That this child lives in multiple cultures, actually, and that's some of the challenges with those coming in from an outside culture. You're arriving in a new culture, and you're not really understanding you're going through the process of entering a new culture, the stages. And the initial stage, of course, would be where everything looks nice and so on, until you begin to get to where the rubber meets the road. But in this situation, actually, the funny thing was that this child was born and bred down south, and so relocated. And of course, I know you would tell me, and we all know, that the culture down south is totally different from the culture up north. In fact, I actually noticed that the culture in Aberdeen is totally different from, in some ways, different from Glasgow. Like the story I told you earlier, I remember going into Glasgow, and myself and my daughter, we were looking for our way around, and I got on the bus and I asked the bus driver, how do I get to a place like so and so place? And the bus driver said, you come in, I'll take you there, I'll take you close by. When we get towards the place, and then we got there, and actually he didn't even charge us for it. And when we got close by, he said, you're going to go down here, and you know, he tried to direct me. So cultures vary. So when I got to the school of this child, and I was trying to let the school understand that this child is living in multiple cultures. The culture at home is an African culture, even though this child had been born in Britain. The culture in the school down south where that child had grown is different from the culture in Scotland. And that child had been used to the culture over there and is coming into Scotland, and some of the things he's been used to doing was seen as unacceptable. So while I was trying to understand and asking questions and observing, we'd had a meeting with the group in the school. And as we were coming out of that meeting, and the child was coming with us, while in the passage I could hear, hello, how are you? I said, okay. I know what one of these misbehavior is. He's expected to be very quiet and to behave quietly and in a very, very Scottish way. And I said to the mother, the parents, I said, now, this is one of the misbehavior. And what has happened? And I then discover, a typical Nigerian father who possibly has grown in Nigeria, and somebody was telling me some time back that this is done in US. So what you do is you wake up in the morning and you call in on your neighbor, hello neighbor, how are you this morning? And the neighbor is shouting to you on the other side and saying, I'm fine, and things like that. It's just, I am because we are. That you don't wake up in the morning and just think that it's my world and it's my world alone. And you want to find out what is happening to your friend, your neighbor. You see somebody, you say, hi, how are you? And so on. And so this child has grown to see his dad say hi to people from a distance. And he's coming into a Scottish environment and saying hi. And he's being told that is a misbehavior. And he also couldn't understand. So we needed to, while we do not want to take that value from him, that value of wanting him to be friendly, to be open, to associate with people, we also want to let him know that you are in a different culture here. You need to tone down that high. And when you are within that environment, you need to learn how to behave. So those actions and activities and so on determine the culture, our own culture, the culture we have found ourselves in, and the wider culture. Within the African culture also is the concept of respect for elders. There are some things that Africans don't compromise, or as much as possible, it's become part of the African and leaves it out wherever they go to. So, because of respect for elders, which is taught right from childhood, you find an African, you get into a community and maybe you're a lecturer, you might even be younger than that person, but the fact that you occupy that position, they respect that position, and sometimes they don't want to call you by name, as it is common in the environment. And sometimes we're not comfortable with that and we're wondering, what's this person doing? But can I shock you? The other major aspect of it is that because there are no brothers, there are no cousins, aunties, and so on, every older person is a mom or a sister or a father or a brother. There is no concept of cousin. We don't have it in the African languages. It's either brother or sister, mom or dad. So whoever is about your father's age age group is known as dad, whoever is mother's age group is known as mom, and whoever is a brother or sister. And so, coming into the context, many times, before people get accustomed to the setting, you find yourself being called, maybe person being quite formal, and you're wondering what's going on here. It's because they've been used to that, and that, I'll come to that even in more details. And that talks about the communal mindset, communal relationship within the African setting. And so the culture determines, and Africans go everywhere with their culture, because that defines who they are. Within the culture also, one of the challenges that the African will find within the Western European, Western culture, which is something we always have problem with, is the concept of eye contact. Respect within the setting is, within the African context, is that you don't keep an eye contact with somebody who is regarded as an elder or an older person and things. And we had this experience when we came in. Our little boy came into Scotland at about the age of 3, so he didn't really live back in Africa and imbibe much of the culture. He's more Scots than Nigerian. So one of the days when he was, I think, in primary 2 or something, still very young, his dad was trying to correct him on something, and he stood. And in our culture, when you're being corrected, you leave immediately to do what you're being told to do. And so he stood and he wasn't moving, and the dad was wondering, why aren't you moving? You need to get going and do what you've been told to do. And then I saw the way he his body language. And then later I called him and I said, come, what is it? What is the problem? He said, Mom, in school you dare not do that. You're meant to stand until the teachers finish with what they are saying before you move. So I said, we have a problem here. We have a culture clash here. Because within the culture in which he is growing is totally different from the culture he's found himself in school. And so we had to start educating them and say, in our own culture, my children would always hear me say that, in our culture, this is what we do. In the Scottish culture, this is what happens, so as to help them navigate both. And so in trying to understand the African and understand where they're coming from, the culture, where they're coming from, it's important to understand their language. This is equally true, whether we accept it or not. Within the European setting, there are cultures and there are subcultures. And the culture has evolved from a worldview, has evolved from the various things, the various activities, action, value, mindset, and all that means a lot to us, has determined our culture, even in the West. I think, and I don't know whether we accept it or we don't accept it, but these cultures, as they determine who we are, they also interplay. And over the years, more so with the current internet and the rest, the social media, we have so many cultures and we have many subcultures forming. So you may discover that in your home, for example, you're living in multiple cultures. Your children are exposed to American culture from whatever they're watching. They're exposed to Scottish culture, maybe British culture, maybe Asian culture, and so on. But whatever it is important to understand that the incoming individual is coming with a culture and is coming into another culture. And so understanding that enables us that when these cultural practices are taking place, or cultural actions and activities, we are able to view it as peculiar to them, and we also have ours. But when we don't believe that we have culture, or our mindset is guided by our culture, then we'll live in denial and we'll keep seeing others as either primitive or not behaving as expected, in quote. That brings me to communities. I am because we are. That's a concept which in African context is called Ubuntu. Ubuntu means that I can't live as an island. And none of us is an island. And none of us can live on our own. And I think one of the things that has brought that so clearly is the COVID. I don't know how you felt when you couldn't associate with people, when you were not meant to speak with people, you couldn't, even your family, you couldn't touch family members, you could not maybe even live in the same space. It just brings out the concept that humans are meant to interact. And so the concept of Ubuntu is, the concept of I am because we are, means that we are all human and we are all meant to interact with each other as humans. But taking it from there, the African mindset is that Africans live in communities. Community is extremely important to the Africans. And community, what do I mean by community? All people who live in a particular area, could be geographical, could be a group in a particular setting, and so on, are considered to live, to be living in community, in groups, whatever the groups may be. But even within the African context, the community is the concept that gives the African his or her identity, and actually that's where I am because we are evolves from. The individual identity is defined by the communal identity, and the individual derives his or her value, self-worth, identity from the community. Within that community, you would have people who live together, but at the same time, a structure. They are usually structures depending on which area of the context you find yourself, or which area the people are coming from. I've had people ask me, is there anything like the African mindset or the African culture? In some sense, in a sense, yes. And in another sense, no. Yes is that there are value systems, there are concepts that cut across the continent. And the major three that I've highlighted, one is the concept of religion or spirituality, whatever we want to call it, is the same. The concept of God, every African has that within them because that's who they are. The other is the concept of community. And so you get to a community. I was listening to interacting with a Scot who was married to an African, And she said to me, when we got married, my husband told me he has 3 sisters and a brother. And then each time somebody came, the sisters increased. And then it went beyond 3, it went beyond 4. And all the time I kept hearing, this is my sister, this is my brother. And I just couldn't place it. And she was really struggling with that. And she actually struggled with it, and things went wrong. But on both sides, I think because we don't consciously think about and discuss these issues, we probably don't think about where the world view is influencing people's behavior and people's action. Now, for that Scott, family means me, my husband, and my children. Am I lying? I don't think so. For an African, family means my immediate family, my parents, my cousins, my nephews. When I'm thinking family, or when an African is thinking family, it's not just me, my husband, and my children. It is actually not just my blood relation, but my community. And so that's why that gentleman, each time somebody comes in and he says to the wife, my sister has arrived. And she's like, which sister again? I thought you had 3 sisters. Where are all these ones coming from? And he hasn't thought, he did not think of explaining, because as far as he's concerned, they are his sisters. And so you will hear an African, maybe somebody comes in and I'd never seen the person before, and I say, oh, hi, my brother, my sister. It is understood in the community. And that's because within the community, people lived together. I am because we are. People live together in community. And they cared for each other. So you could have a house of maybe a couple with 4 children, but within that house, there are 30 people living in that same house. And that's because people have learned to care for one another, live together in communities, and be there for one another. And that concept, as they live together, as they care for each other and support each other, they are also accountable to one another. So the elders, these days when the cities, people live in cities, they no longer live within either the villages or close to family members. When they did, the elders in the community become the leaders. So they find correction, they care for the younger folk, they care for the children, they care for the grandchildren, and they care for the wider community. And you have leaders within the community who would be concerned and who would take charge, who take responsibility for others and for the younger ones within the community. And so community is a major and a key factor within the African setting. And when people come into a setting like this, where it becomes a bit difficult for them to be able to practice such, there's a sense of either taken away a value, they've lost a value, a specific, a particular, a valuable part of who they are, because that community is no longer there. And the other factor is that people come in not having thought through where they're coming into, and they're coming in expecting or looking forward to having such communities. Yes, when you get to see your tribesmen or your kingsmen, you're excited and you want to relate with them, but the local community does not know. Remember, it takes us back to expectation. The local community doesn't live within that world view. And so it's important for the arriving community to understand that we're coming into a completely different setting, a completely different mindset, seeking to understand that mindset and balancing that is important, just as the receiving community would seek to understand the arriving community and seek to balance that also. And sometimes the arriving community finds it difficult to understand the receiving community because the language is different, the expectations are different, but because the receiving community has a specific language that is being expected, or that the arriving community is expected to know, to have, and to relate in, it becomes difficult for both communities to interact, and people withdraw into their shell. And that withdrawal makes it difficult for people to adjust and to settle. And so, as I said earlier, within this community, as people live together, they do virtually everything in support of each other. That would include grieving together. It would include rejoicing together. And when they say, I am because we are, I remember several times back in Nigeria where, as an adult, I would find a child in a situation that is unacceptable as a parent, and I scold that child because that child is my child. It's not my biological child, but I'm responsible for that child. And there's a saying in our culture that says that a parent gives birth to a child, but the entire community cares for that child, nurtures that child, brings up that child. So when I see that child, I remember about 2 weeks ago, I was at the King's Church. I'd gone for a meeting, and I saw a friend who had just brought a grandchild, and the grandchild is half Nigerian, and I said to her, I can see myself in this child. They couldn't put that together. I said, yeah, I am seeing myself in that child because that child has a part of me. So I had to explain to them, that child is half African. So it's my child wherever. Oh, okay. Yeah, that child also has a part of us. So yeah, that's who we are. You know, I mean, whether on the road or wherever I see an African child, that child is my child because the entire community brings up that child and nurtures that child. And I compliment that child, or I try to correct when that child is not doing something right. So the communal lifestyle means that we care for each other, you nurture each other, we support each other wherever you are. I am because we are. It's a community mindset, and it's a community care for each other. And when all of this take place, it's the support that they give. And so the reality of the African life in communities, the community also means that in the formulation of the traditional African community involves or includes the living dead. That will sound strange to some of us, isn't it? It is believed that when people die, they live on in the world beyond. And so they become like elders within the community. They are known as the living dead. It's interesting because the difference between that and the scripture, the Christian worldview, is that the dead are living in heaven and they become witnesses. So the Bible talks about the cloud of witnesses. Well, the African mindset is that these witnesses are also still living among the people. But the scripture tells us that they are in heaven, they are now. So that's a major difference. But within the African mindset, the living dead is part of the community. The living is part of the community. That's the people that are alive. The deities are part of the community. And the unborn children are part of the community. So the community is bigger than maybe just the view of the person or the family that you have seen. That is where the thinking comes from. And as the person begins to talk, interact with you, relate with you, they're actually relating from that mindset, and their understanding involves all of that. So when they come into a community that in the community it's me, my husband and my children, or me and my family, it becomes difficult to understand that. But even in seeking and in trying to understand that, the concept of the wider care for each other and interaction for each other is withdrawn, kind of. So they don't interact easily because what they are finding is different from what they are used to. And the receiving culture also is struggling with that, because how can this person tell me that family has got to do with all of these other people you are talking about? You know, your cousins will be described as cousin in the West, but they are sisters back home, and so they keep coming and they keep increasing. And so the community comes before the individual. And so they also have each other's back as much as possible. They have each other's back, they care for each other, they support each other. I am because we are. The African mindset does not compartmentalize life. The Western mindset, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. The Western mindset compartmentalizes life. So my work life is my work life. My social life is my social life. And if I want to keep them apart, I could do that. Within the African mindset, it is all interwoven and revolves from that world view. And so the African tells you that if I have maybe, for example, if I have a problem at work, there's a spiritual angle to it, there is a cultural angle to it, there's a physical angle to it, there's probably a financial angle to it, and he wants to analyze it from all of this. And the Western the Western perspective says, no, I'll put them aside. So it's a holistic kind of life, and everything is interwoven and linked together in various ways. And then, whether you think I'm advertising myself or not, I don't know, but as a counselor, as a pastoral counselor within a Western setting, that is one of the struggles I personally have. Because the counseling bodies will tell you if you're a psychologist, you just handle that and deal with that, and whatever theory, maybe you're a person-centered counselor, just relate with that and don't venture into other areas or whatever. For me, when an African sits before me and says, I have, for example, maybe the person says, I have problem at work, I think I'm being bewitched, and you will hear that a number of times, I'm being bewitched, and that's affecting me from my play at my workplace. My children are not feeling well. That bewitchment is affecting my children and it's affecting my family. I need to understand that from where that person is coming from. And that is what makes sense to that person. The Western counseling would say to me, if the person says they are bewitched and you probably are person-centered, maybe the other thing I do, I'm a pastoral supervisor, that actually defines it quite a bit. I said, well, we're talking about your job here or your ministry or your work. We're not talking about your bewitchment here. So, if you think you are bewitched, then I need to refer you to a minister or something. Not because I'm a minister, but because I'm an African. I know that when that person is saying that, that is what matters to that person. And if I don't dig into that and we walk through that, then I would not, especially if the person is an African, I would not have done justice there. So the African mindset that looks at the entire life, their entire situation as a whole, compared with where we're at, the Western mindset that puts things in compartments. So as you work with an African or relate with an African, and the African is coming and explaining all of these in terms of their mindset, in terms of where they are coming from, the important thing is, if we don't understand them, it's important to ask questions, to seek to understand where they're coming from. At the same time, as Africans, having come from a different mindset also, it's important to seek to understand the local worldview and the way that the local mindset works. So that when we're relating and it seems as if we are way apart from each other, is not because we're working counter to each other, it's because we're working from a mindset that has been conditioned right from childhood and determines who we are and where we have come from. So, the question now would be, how do we understand each other? As we bring these two world views, actually, it's a program of two different world views. Bringing these world views together and seeking to understand where each other is coming from, the African worldview and the European worldview or the Western worldview, it is important that we ask questions. We ask questions. I use the term bilingual sometimes, and especially within the counseling setting. In my research, I had encouraged that it's important that the counselor is bilingual. And what I mean by that is not that you go learn all the languages that your clients speak or their culture, but is to seek to understand the other culture as much as possible. So if I have an Asian before me and the Asian is saying that, maybe an aspect of life I don't understand, as a counselor or even as somebody within the community, it's important that I say, when you say that, what does that mean where you're coming from? Help me understand what you mean by what you're saying. But sometimes we don't think in that direction and we just assume this person is weird. It's easy to think that the other person is weird. I could actually be the weird one. And so how do we define that weirdness? Or how do we define the other person in relation to ourselves. And I am because we are means that I allow that person be who they are, but I accept that person just as they are and seek to understand the person, just as I encourage them to seek to understand me also. And it's when we understand each other that we can relate freely, that we can support each other, and we can be there for each other. The other important thing to the African is honesty and sincerity, and I think that is across, is from both ends, such that I know we know that as humans we are good at reading body language. Communication will tell us that at least, I can't remember the percentage, but at least 80% of our belief is based on body language. And so if the coming culture discovers that there are interactions that don't really that are dissonance to each other, the tendency is to believe the non-verbal language. At the same time also is the same with the other cultures. So just being plain, being simple, and being open, and just discussing openly would be quite helpful in mediating between both mindsets. Acceptance is also important to enable the arriving culture integrate in the new culture. Learning and just accepting people for who they are, and accepting them in a very, with whatever, about seeking to understand them within that acceptance. And for the arriving culture, it's important to intentionally work at integrating, especially if the coming culture is wanting to remain within the new culture for a while. It's important to learn to integrate. I'll begin to round up. I think my time is up. It's important to follow through with promises, and well, if you want to learn more or want to read more around that, you can pick that. That is looking at the Western mindset and the African mindset, especially in relation to counseling. I'll take questions if there are. Thanks for being good listeners. I hope I haven't bored you.